Catherine, Cameron, Rob. I'm Bob Blum from Johns Hopkins University. As is true for so many people here, I look out and I see the threads of Doug's life, and I see the threads of many of our lives. Let me just briefly say how and when I first met Doug, because it was very memorable. I don't know exactly why, but I was having lunch with Judith Sendorowitz at Center for Population Options, and Doug came along, and we were discussing something which I can't recall at all. Question turned to my family and how many kids I had, and Judith asked, and I said, because I was very proud, I just had a third child, I said 3. And Judith looked at me and said, "Isn't that excessive, don't you think?" I'm not exactly sure what my response was. I did look across at Doug, and he seemed a bit horrified. After lunch and the conversation with Judith ended, Doug and I had a chance to chat. And it was from that conversation that a friendship developed. I lived in Minnesota, but I came to Washington often, and I saw Doug often. We would run along the towpath, I gasping for air, and he talking about a woman who he had just met at a giant grocery store. And while I was struggling for breath, Doug kept asking more and more intense questions. And I didn't know if I should keep running or stop and talk. And he would look at me, and we all have had this experience. And he would say, "No, really, what I really, really wanted to know." And that was one of the characteristics that made him so wonderful, was that he was intent on knowing what you knew, but he was much more intent on knowing who you were. And that intensity was something that others spoke about. I asked some of the colleagues who I knew who knew him some experiences. Lynn Barringer from Minnesota said he never let a comment or question go unchallenged, even if we were jostling down a dirt road, dodging cars and potholes in rural Thailand. In the middle of it, Doug would pose tough questions related to observations, his own thoughts on paper he was in the midst of writing, or is it an existential musing? He would always press for more and more understanding. That, I think, was one of the extraordinary qualities. Deborah spoke about his love for life, and that certainly is reflected in some of the photographs. We would talk often and compare notes, I about biking, he about mountain climbing. But the memory that I have most vividly of the outdoors was when I was visiting your home, and you weren't there. And Doug said, "Let's go for a walk." And my wife Michael was with us, and we went out back. And we walked through a path. That path was later named for him because of his passionate dedication to clearing it and establishing it. And I have rarely seen pride and joy and the love of nature as reflected in that man's eyes as we walked down that path. Doug was profoundly intellectually honest and profoundly meticulous. Data drove his advocacy. Advocacy did not drive his data, nor his research. And because of that, and because of who he was as a person, He bridged a broad political divide. He was able to connect with people whose fundamental orientation was very, very different than his. I received a note from Ted Green, and Ted said, because he was talking about a situation where originally he, Ted, and Doug were PIs on a project in Uganda, and then Doug took it over. And Ted said, we both came to very similar conclusions from very different vantage points about the importance of partner reduction. I'll admit that there was some tension between us when USAID replaced me with Doug. But the people who knew Doug well said, Doug is impossible to dislike. I know the two of you will get along great once this little issue is resolved. He said the issue was resolved. How right they were. Doug's commitment. But there's one other story that I will quickly tell of his meticulousness. And it's a story Lynn Barringer said, and it occurred before internet days and before email. And Doug arrived in a city, and he wasn't sure where he was going to go. He didn't know, he knew the hotel, but he didn't know where he was going to be giving a talk. He didn't know what time he was going to be giving a talk. And so Doug set out from the hotel and started walking in concentric circles because he figured they're going to put me pretty near to where I'm going to talk. An hour and a half later, in a restaurant window, he saw this little flyer for Doug Kirby to be giving a speech the next day. Bingo. We all have wonderful stories. We all have wonderful memories. And I think that is the joy. So Doug, your absence leaves a hole in our hearts, a tear into the intellectual fiber of adolescent health, but it also brings a smile to our face when we remember you.